long before the flood reshaped the face of the earth, when the horizon still trembled with the memory of first light, and the sky seemed nearer to hands, there came down from heaven a company of watchers. They made their camp upon Mount Hermon, and what was spoken there would mark the course of generations. Among them was Sariel, who kept his gaze often lifted toward the high places of the heavens, even as others lowered theirs to the stirrings of the earth. If you will stay until the end of this telling, subscribe and ring the bell to follow more deep dives into the hidden traditions that shaped ancient faith. Like the story, leave your mark with a like if it stirs your thought, and share it with one who seeks what once hovered between heaven and earth. They gathered at the summit in the hour when the air grew thin and the stones held the cold. Semjaza stood and swore, and with him nearly 200 of those called watchers, angels sent to keep watch over men. In that place the wind seemed to carry a weight of promise. Torches of starlight trembled along their wings. The scent of crushed mountain herbs rose and fell with their breath. Their oath was simple, swift, and terrible. Together they would bind themselves to a single will and step beneath the firmament to take daughters of men as wives, to teach and to rule. They sealed the vow with a name and with the mountain under them, as if to set the earth itself as witness. Sariel stood at the edge of that circle. He was not silent by fear, but by attention. His mind measured the angles of choice like a man attentive to the lines of a plumb. He had come to watch as it was given to him, to bear witness to the ways of men. Yet even in the hush of that night, the company's speech carried a warmth that felt like temptation. Some spoke of the marvels to be shared, smithing that would turn ore into blade, secrets of the stars that would allow men to read fate, arts that bent words into binding. Others spoke of desire with a frankness that cut at law. Semjaza's voice was iron. The assembly answered as if a new order had dawned. "Why shall we remain aloof while the sons of men grope in their weakness?" one watcher asked, voice like broken bronze. "Shall we not teach them and shape the world by our hand?" Another voice, quick with ambition, added, "To rule is to bring order is to leave a name." Sariel listened and felt the strain of the heavens as a chord within him. He had seen human faces up close, the quick tears, the brief joys, the small, fearless prayers uttered by the hearth. He had watched how a child's hope could rise like smoke and be snuffed by those who knew more than they were meant. In that seeing, he found no license for dominion. To him, the heavens were not a storehouse of dominion, but a vault of stewardship. To take and to fashion for pride was to deceive the very purpose of watchfulness. He spoke but once at the summit, and his words were neither long nor loud. "Look upward," he said, and the phrase was like a hand laid on a fevered brow. "There is a measure beyond our choosing. To bind ourselves here will bind the earth to ruin." The watchers regarded him as one might regard a cloud before a storm, present, possible, to be weighed. Semjaza's eyes narrowed. "We are chosen to bring light," he replied. "Shall we not bring craft and wisdom to the children of men?" The answer to that claim would prove the hinge of history. The watchers who followed Semjaza descended into the lowlands. They took wives from the daughters of men and taught them things that had been kept back. They showed how to extract metal from the belly of the earth and fashion it to weapons and ornament. They taught signs of the heavens that led men into curious lore and spells. They unfolded the names of spirits and the methods to bind them. The earth, unready for such sudden knowledge, shivered. Where their hands moved, new implements cut the soil and shifted the lives of farmers and shepherds. Old balances failed beneath the weight of sudden craft. Sariel followed, not to match them step for step, but that he might see more clearly what consequences their counsel would sow. He observed at a distance, his feet in the dust, his eyes fixed more on the vault above than on the marvels below. From afar, he watched one of the watchers teach a man how to temper bronze. He listened to laughter turned rough when men learned too fast. He saw children grow tall faster than their steadiness, and the seeds of violence take root in sudden strength. He saw rights that made the sky tremble, not with praise, but with arrogance. The Nephilim came forth, giants born of that mingling, whose presence alone bent valleys with their tread and set villages trembling like leaves in a hard wind. They were not described by the ancients with gore and delight, but by calamity. They brought terror, and their shadow lay long over the fields and the wellsprings. The smell that rose where these abominations multiplied was not simply of flesh, but of a certainty that order had been disturbed. Smoke of burning offal, the metallic ring of blades newly made, the acrid tang of herbs used to call things not meant to be called. Sariel felt his heart quake, not for himself, but for the humans who would pay for an overmuch of knowledge. He tried again to counsel, this time in the company of a few who were wavering. "Teach not what will harden the soul," he said to one whose pride flared like a brand. "Wisdom is a gift to temper, not a fire to consume." But counsel given amid desire is like a cup of water in a furnace. The watchers who had tasted power would not so easily return to restraint. Semjaza's leadership held as a rope binds a crowd. Those who had vowed could not be unswearing without shame. The people who had learned the arts began to use them in ways older law had not foresaw. Incantations, charms, the forging of tools that served the fist rather than the hand. Men learned of the stars and gave themselves to omens. Where knowledge should have been a lantern, it became a hedge that boxed in the soul. As the land groaned under these deeds, the clamor rose upward. The outcry of fathers and mothers, of widows and old men, the prayer of children whose flocks were seized, all these sounds ascended like smoke to the courts of heaven. The Maker, who had set order to the stars and given measure to the sea, heard the breach and set the plan of correction in motion. He sent forth the archangels, Michael with the calm of unassailable law, Raphael, whose hands heal and whose gaze discerns, Gabriel, the voice that brings decree, and Uriel, the light that reads the deep. They came as storm wind comes to the hill, swift and inexorable. It was not a spectacle of wrath without justice. The archangels moved with the authority of one who knows the heart and the full course of consequence. They bound the leaders of the rebellion. They declared the seals that would hold the watchers until the day of final judgment. The earth, relieved by the removal of such corrupting counsel, began in small measures to return to its ways. Where devastation had been broad, there remained scars. Lakes silted, orchards burned, villages hollowed by fear and memory. Those marks were not ignored by heaven, nor by those who remained to care for the living. Sariel, however, was called apart. The narrative that holds to the ancient witness does not erase his presence in the circle. It instead marks him as an exception. He was summoned not with accusation, but with a hearing that weighed intent as carefully as action. In the court before the throne, there was no clamor of the world. There was only the hush of things made right. Sariel stood with the earth in his steps and the sky in his thought, and his heart was as one who has seen tides and prays they might yet be guided. He did not plead with the eloquence of those who would win by honeyed words. He said simply that he had kept his charge, that when the company swore, he had not joined them in taking what was not given, that he had raised his voice in council, though his words had been small against a multitude. He acknowledged sorrow for those blackened consequences that had followed the others, and he offered himself to any task that might ease the harm. There was silence afterward, a silence like the pause between a deep inhalation and a required reply. Then, as the record handed down in Enochian witness tells, mercy met justice in form and decree. Sariel was not left unaltered. No being passes untouched through such counsel. but he was restored in a manner distinct from the fate of his fellows. He was set apart to a task of guardianship, to watch over those human spirits whose hearts, even amid ruin, still turned toward what is good. He would be given the ministry of lifting certain souls, guiding remnants of hope, and ferrying them toward the light. It was a station of labor and a sign that the sway of mercy could attend even to the consequences of a broken world. When Sariel returned to the earth, it was not as one wearing the same robe. There was a new steadiness in his bearing, as when a shepherd learns the contour of a dangerous cliff and walks more slowly for others' sake. He moved among ruins and rebuilt what he could not fully repair. He became a presence in the edge places, where a widow sat by a silent hearth, where a small child still dared to name a dream. He did not step among men with the swagger of those who sought rule. He came with hands that knew how to steady, with words that asked less to be heard and more to make a path for others to follow. Enoch, the scribe of visions, would later write that such exceptions are meant to teach as much as the judgments that follow. Sariel's story served as a lesson and a hope, that choice remains carried by created beings, and that choices bear consequences, but also that those same beings, when they return their gaze heavenward and align themselves anew with the purpose of stewardship, may be given a work that turns sorrow into service. The mountain remained as a memory and a warning. The seals remained, a testament to the measure of divine order. And yet a single restored watcher walked the paths between the worlds, tending spirits that clung to faith like embers in ash. There were those among men who felt his coming as a quiet mending. Fields that once lay fallow showed shoots where hands learned to plant without greed. Rites once used to call shadows were reformed into prayers that named mercy. Sariel's work was not loud. Redemption, when practiced, often moves in the small mercies of daily tending. He taught not to dominate but to steward, not to seize but to keep, and in this slow labor the memory of the summit at Hermon became a story told with a caution in its throat and a hope at its heart. Wherever the path led, Sariel kept a look to the sky. He had learned that looking upward is not only a refusal of the earth's easier gratifications, but an alignment with purpose that outlasts present storms. In the quiet between seasons, he would sometimes stand upon a ridge and listen to the wind that had once carried the vows, feeling the old weight and the new calling braided together like two ropes. To watch, in truth, he had discovered, is not merely to see, but to keep faith with what one has been made to guard. He was not alone in the memory of heaven. The archangels kept their counsel, the seals remained, and men kept both fear and gratitude in their chests. But Sariel's presence offered a possibility that stubbornly held its ground, that even among beings who knew heights and fell into error, repentance might be recognized and service restored. In that fragile mercy lay a promise, not that the world would be spared every sorrow, but that sorrow could be met by repair when hearts turned. Thus the tale passed into the keeping of Enoch and his kindred, a witness to the complex dance of choice, consequence, judgment, and mercy. Yet even as Sariel labored, questions lingered in the whispering places, about the measure of knowledge, about the line between teaching and corrupting, about the manner in which power is held or abused. Those questions were not settled by one restored watcher, and their answering would demand the care of many generations. Sariel knew this. His task was not to answer all, but to keep watch over what might yet be mended. He who had once stood apart at Hermon now moved among the embers, a vigilant hand upon fragile hope. Where people bowed in fear or in prayer, he gathered what he could, guiding spirits toward any rising light. And when the final day comes, of which the ancient record speaks, his sealing and his labor will be remembered as both a sign of what fall can bring and of what mercy may yet redeem. And the days went on, and Sariel walked among the low places as one who bears a quiet flame. He came at dawn to a village whose roofed houses lay close together like the scales of a fish, and he stayed until the last pot was set upon the smoke. Where children ran barefoot and called names after birds, he would kneel and show them how to lift a seed into earth. Where hands were crooked with mourning, he would lay no judgment, but steady the fingers to braid a cord, to mend a garment, to hold a lamp while a widow slept. It was in such small ministrations that the shape of his repentance was made manifest, not in thunder from high, but in the patient turning of work toward the good of others. Men spoke of him in many voices. Some called him the mender. Others said, with a tightness in the throat, that his coming was a question mark at the edge of God's ordinance. There were those who remembered the summit and the promises made there, and they trembled. There were others, poorer in understanding but rich in hope, who pressed to his feet and would not be refused peace. He would not answer every plea, for the law of the heavens held its weight. Yet he would not send away the lowly with empty hands. And so it came that in time the people grew wary of certain arts, and learned again to speak of stewardship as a kind of prayer. Enoch continued to write, for the sight he had been granted did not cease to press upon him. He gathered tales as a scribe gathers scrolls, of wells that once were poisoned and now flowed clean, of fields left to greed and now tended with a slow hand, of altars that had been set for secret vows and now stood open to the sun. He penned not only the acts of Sariel, but the murmurs of the heart among men, how a repentant watcher could be a mirror where men saw their own unmade shapes, and how that sight worked both justice and healing. In his book he kept also the warning that knowledge without mercy will carve hollows in the breast of anyone who seeks to command it. Men spoke of him in many voices. Some called him the mender. Others said, with a tightness in the throat, that his coming was a question mark at the edge of God's ordinance. There were those who remembered the summit and the promises made there, and they trembled. There were others, poorer in understanding but rich in hope, who pressed to his feet and would not be refused peace. He would not answer every plea, for the law of the heavens held its weight, yet he would not send away the lowly with empty hands. And so it came that in time the people grew wary of certain arts, and learned again to speak of stewardship as a kind of prayer. Enoch continued to write, for the sight he had been granted did not cease to press upon him. He gathered tales as a scribe gathers scrolls, of wells that once were poisoned and now flowed clean, of fields left to greed and now tended with a slow hand, of altars that had been set for secret vows and now stood open to the sun. He penned not only the acts of Sariel, but the murmurs of the heart among men, how a repentant watcher could be a mirror where men saw their own unmade shapes, and how that sight worked both justice and healing. In his book he kept also the warning that knowledge without mercy will carve hollows in the breast of anyone who seeks to command it. And the people heard him, some with lift of spirit, others with the stubbornness of those who have learned to trust only their own hand. Not all who walked among men accepted his ways. In some towns the old ways held like nettles. Rights that once coveted dominion still rose in the night, and men who had profited from such things were slow to relinquish them. Sariel met them with patience, and with the bluntness of one who knew consequence. He showed how a hand that seeks to bind will sooner or later be bound to sorrow, and in the telling he allowed that the memory of error can be a tutor. Some yielded and mended, others hardened and watched for an hour to reclaim what they had lost. For such there were still tightenings in the world, a rumor that knowledge returns to the unscrupulous, a fear that mercy might pardon and thus embolden. In the courts of elders and under the shade of city gates, the old men weighed what this restored watcher brought. They asked whether mercy should have room within the order, and whether repentance that restores work is a gift to be accepted. The anointed priests debated with scribes, and the young listened, learning to judge between hope and history. Enoch's records fed into such debates, for his witness was not an argument but a mirror. He did not command but recorded, and thus men found in his writings both evidence and invitation. He would speak of the balance that must be kept, that law without compassion hardens, and compassion without law wastes. Thus the generations turned, and Sariel's labor became a rhythm within the world's troubled music. He tended those who clung like embers to faith, and he did not turn from the scarred places where knowledge had been misused. In secret, too, there were those watchers who met at dusk and contemplated the measure of their charge. They spoke quietly, bearing their regret as a lamp that burns low, and they asked whether more of them might be made to stoop and labor like Sariel, whether the mercy shown one could be extended to more, without loosening the cords that bind pride. The heavens answered not in decree, but in time. Some doors opened, some remained fast, and mankind continued in its long apprenticeship of restraint. When storms dispersed and quiet held, Sariel would sometimes sit at the feet of an old man who had seen wars and reckonings, and ask what he had learned. The old man would cough and look at the far hills, and say, that a man may carry a mountain upon his back if he will not lay down his bitterness. Sariel learned that words of the heart carry as much weight as any seal. He learned to lay his own burden down in small acts that linked him to those he served. He did not claim to unmake the past, for some things are not undone. He sought rather to weave the torn edges so that the garment might be warm for another. And in the hush of some nights there came to pass a sign, not of thunder, but of soft sound. A choir of voices from villages lifted the old prayers in new tones, naming mercy with hands that had learned to give. Sariel would stand beneath open skies and lift his eyes not in triumph but in watchfulness, knowing that the world remains a place of both falling and mending. He understood, as his tasks multiplied, that his restoration was not a return to former honor, but a life of humble tending, an answer to the great question of stewardship that had once been answered wrongly upon the mountain. So he kept to the ways of slow repair. And when he walked, the earth seemed to answer with small green things rising where none had been, as if the soil itself remembered mercy and made room for it. The seals upon the high places remained, and the counsel above endured. Yet in the valleys the practice of mercy took root, fragile but tending toward growth. Sariel's shadow passed over threshing floors and beside quiet wells, and wherever it went the people learned, little by little, to carry what they had been given without wishing to make it their God. And while ages folded upon ages, there was always the whisper of a last day in the mouths of the elders, a day when reckonings would be full and the seams of the ages tested. Sariel heard this whisper, as did all who keep watch, and he understood that the repairs he made were not to deny that day, but to prepare a world that could meet it with arms unweighed by tyranny. He kept his eyes on the sky and his hands busy in the earth, for that is the way of one who has seen the summit and chosen the valley as his place of service. He would walk and teach and steady, and in these long acts he made his repentance into a work that might yet be remembered as mercy in an age of judgment.